good to see everybody this morning. I got to be honest with you, I was kind of sad that we were getting so close to the end of the book of Daniel. There's so much to be learned and so much to be reminded. I think I've said it before, it's amazing how much we forget over time if we don't do some in-depth study, and the Word refreshes our heart and our mind with many things that we kind of set aside and forget. But as I was putting my notes down, we won't make it to the end of Daniel today. So take your Bibles and turn to Daniel chapter 11. We'll pick up where we left off last week. Take a look at verse 36. And the king shall do according to his will, and he shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak marvelous things against the God of gods, and shall prosper till the indignation be accomplished, for that is determined shall be done. We stopped at verse 35 last week, not just because we ran out of time, but there's a breaking point here between verse 35 and 36. A dramatic change in characters, and how do we know we've changed characters? Look at the verbiage. Daniel tells us that this king is going to do according to his will. Now you remember, as we've learned of Antiochus, his great crime was setting up a statue of Zeus in the temple. And while that was bad enough, it pales in comparison to what the Antichrist is going to do. What Daniel tells us here is that he's going to exalt himself above every god, and declare himself to be God. And like Nebuchadnezzar, he will demand that everybody worship him. And we can rest assured the penalty will be the same. If you don't, you're going to die. So there's going to be no more democracy. Once the Antichrist comes on scene, as we've seen in past passages concerning him, in the comparison with Antiochus Epiphanes, using flattery and good sounding speech and being a political kind of person, he's going to manage to work his way into a one-man rule of the entire world. All the kings of the world, as he divides it up and sets it up, organizes it and everything, will obey his every whim. Now I want to stop for just a minute here, because we changed characters without any indication or any notice. And I'll go back to the beginning of chapter 10 when Daniel had that incredible vision of the image that was very much like the same image Ezekiel had and John had in Revelation. And we talked about that not being Christ, because it didn't change. Just like this, Daniel flowed, but it didn't give any indication that he changed characters. Right. But if he did, it was kind of, a lot of people believe at the point that, remember, Daniel passed out. I mean, he went completely unconscious, face planted on the ground. He could hear what was being said to him. But then the angel touched him and got him back up on his hands and knees and back up on his feet. If that character change took place there like it does here, that very likely could have been a pre-incarnate vision of Christ that Daniel had. It doesn't say, and I'm not going to say absolutely one way or the other, but I will hold to that. If that had been Christ, there had to be a change in the thing there, because he would not have needed Michael's help in dealing with Satan. So we can go with that as it is. Now, the Antichrist is going to bring in a great period of trouble to the world, such as the world has never known. And let's flip over to Matthew chapter 24. Jesus talks about it in verse 15. We'll be going back to chapter 24 several times this morning. Jesus says, "When you therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand. Then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains. Let him which is on the housetop not come down to take anything out of the house, neither let him which is in the field return back to take his clothes. And woe unto them that are with child, and to them that give suck in those days. But pray ye that your flight be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath days, for then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. And except those days should be shortened, there should no flesh be saved, but for the elect's sake those days shall be shortened." And the Apostle Paul gave a very detailed description of the Antichrist and what the Bible describes as the abomination of desolation in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 in verses 3 and 4. Now, Daniel tells us that during his time, the Antichrist is going to prosper. He's going to increase in power and might and strength. We'll see in some later verses, not just in a political realm, but militarily, until the wrath has been accomplished. Well, what wrath? Well, it's God's wrath being poured out upon the world for the curse of sin, and things are going to go. I'm sure the Antichrist is going to think at times that he's got all this in his control, that he's doing what he wants to do. But remember, just as with Nebuchadnezzar and Darius and Cyrus, and they never stepped outside the bounds of what God allowed them to do. That the ray of hope through all of this is that even though the Antichrist has power for a time, it's a time limit set by God, and he'll not go any further or accomplish any more than what God will allow him to accomplish. That's right. Look in verses 37 and 39. "Neither shall he regard the God of his fathers, nor the desire of women, nor regard any God, for he shall magnify himself above all. But in his estate shall he honor the God of forces, and a God whom his fathers knew not shall he honor with gold and silver, and with precious stones and pleasant things. Thus shall he do in the most strongholds with a strange God, whom he shall acknowledge and increase with glory, and he shall cause them to rule over many, and shall divide the land for gain." A lot of people think the statement here, Jewish idiom, that he had no regard for the God of his fathers, says that the Antichrist is going to be of a Jewish heritage. Now, I don't know how that lies with all those who've said with rock solid surety that he's going to be a Roman, unless he's a Roman Jew. Until the day I was saved, I had no regard for the God of my fathers. Honestly, if you want to look at it. So I'm not going to stand on concrete that, he's coming from a Jewish heritage or even a Roman heritage. One thing's for sure, other than his view of himself, he's of an atheist background, and he's going to be looked upon as, in the beginning, as some kind of a great political peacemaking savior of the world, and the world's going to just fall head over heels in love with him. I mean, he's going to do things that presidents and people have been trying to do and accomplish for years. And I absolutely believe the world's just going to fall in love with him. And I believe that'll give way not just to political, but he'll bring in a false religion as well. I've got my views on who that'll be or how he'll use them. I have a very strong internal belief that the Catholic Church is going to be a part of his program, and the Pope end up being a false prophet or some religious figurehead in his thing. Now, here's another statement we need to look at, because he said he has no regard for the desire of women. A lot of commentators jumped up and said, well, he must be a sodomite. That's missing. It very likely could be. I mean, there's no reason to think that he wouldn't be, but that misses the point of that statement. Every Jewish woman prayed and had a desire for the honor, the privilege of being the mother of the Messiah. From the time the prophets began to announce the Messiah's coming, it would have been every woman's dream to have been the one that Mary, that God picked to be the mother of the Messiah. And that's what that statement means. But knowing, because he's going to know who the Messiah is and all that beforehand, he's got no regard. There's no process in him that he'd have any reverence for the way God went about doing things and bringing Christ into the world through a virgin birth, and blessing Mary with the privilege and the honor of being his mother. He'll have no regard for any of that stuff. It says he's going to, again, Daniel says here, that he's going to exalt himself above all gods. Now, in the beginning, he's going to appear like a very benevolent leader. I'm bringing peace to the world. We're bringing great things. You're enjoying things you've never enjoyed. But when he declares himself to be God and demands people worship him, that benevolence is going to turn to malevolence. He's not going to be so easy to get along with, especially for the Jewish people and those in Jerusalem. And we begin to see here, Daniel began to speak about his military power and strongholds, do most strongholds with strange gods and the god of forces. Daniel begins to speak about that. Can you imagine? I mean, there's a lot of talk today about a rising conflict between the U.S. and China. And we had an Air Force general just the other day said, I'm going to be surprised if we get past 2025 without China invading Taiwan and America having to get involved with it. And so there's a lot of talk about how militaries match up. Can you imagine the ruler of the entire world having every nation's military at his disposal? Should any nation rebel against him or rise up in any way, how quickly he can put that down and just wipe out, if he so chooses, an entire country. So yeah, this is not going to be a good time to live. And praise the Lord, those of us that know Jesus, we get to, I believe we'll be able to watch it, but it'll be from a grandstand in heaven. We'll see. We'll not have to be here through all of that. Again, I want to reiterate, it's important to witness to people and tell folks about Jesus so that they can go to heaven. But let's not forget the aspect of warning them that if they don't, here's what you're going to have to go through if you live long enough to go through it. It's not going to be anything, I promise you, it's not going to be something that you'll want to be part of. Look now then, let's read verses 40 down through 45, the end of chapter 11. And at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships, and he shall enter into the countries and shall overflow and pass over. And it shall enter also into the glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown, but these shall escape out of his hand, even Edom and Moab, and the chief of the children of Ammon. He shall stretch forth his hand also upon the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape, but he shall have power over the treasures of gold and of silver, and over all the precious things of Egypt, and the Libyans and the Ethiopians shall be at his steps, but tidings out of the east and out of the north shall trouble him. Therefore he shall go forth with great fury to destroy and utterly to make away many, and he shall plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas in the glorious holy mountain, yet he shall come to his end, and none shall help him. Daniel's foretelling us about the gathering of the nations coming to war in the Middle East there, and we would call it the Battle of Armageddon. At the end of the time, some of these nations, it looks like, are rising up against him. Maybe they've had enough of his ways, enough of his rule, and these kings are going to revolt. And go back to our study in Ezekiel. He named the nations that were going to come from the north, Gog and Magog. He named the nations that were going to come from the south. There's some of them are mentioned here: Egypt, Libya, Ethiopia. Ezekiel included nations coming from the east, which would be Iraq, Iran, Persia. We know China, we strongly believe China is going to be involved in this last battle. It's why they built that humongous dam so they can literally dry that river up and march their armies across there coming from the east. And I had to wonder because, we've always believed that they're coming after Israel. They're coming after the Jews. This is just a thought I had thinking about this the other night. Are they coming after Israel because this is where the Antichrist is headquartered? In Jerusalem? Is it a combination of both? Do they blame the Jews because that's where he's headed and the rest of the world believes they're part of his thing, his kingdom, his empire? But anyway, these nations are all coming from the north and the south and the east. And we've read, in Ezekiel how it appears like they're going to launch maybe a nuclear attack upon Jerusalem, and God rains fire and brimstone down upon them and destroys all but an eighth of their entire populations. So it's going to be a battle that's going to go on for a while. But Daniel talks about some folks that are going to escape. And he mentions here Edom and Moab and Ammon. Now, what did Jesus tell the disciples and everybody? Remember that little clay? If you're smart enough to listen, you better pay attention and listen here. We read it a while ago in Matthew chapter 24, verse 16. Jesus said, when you see the abomination of desolation, don't waste 1 minute. Get out of here. Flee to the mountains. And people then knew what he was talking about. Jesus wasn't telling people to just scatter. It was a particular place that they were to go to, and then they knew it. Isaiah chapter 16, verse 4, God, through the prophet Isaiah, tells Moab to let the outcasts dwell in that land. And he'll preserve them there. He'll protect them there. And so we believe this is that ancient city of Petra. Yes. And the last 3.5 years of when things are really, the first 3.5 years are bad. The second 3.5 years, I don't know if we even have words bad enough to describe. I mean, you can read Revelation, we'll be there next. But, you can read in Revelation the things that's going on in the world. That last 3.5 years is horrible. But for those who listen to the words of Christ and took the warning and know that when that happens, flee, and those nations are today land or nation we refer to as Jordan. But when they see those things happen, when they see that abomination of desolation take place, and the Antichrist goes into the Holy of Holies and declares himself to be God, get out of here. I told you where to go, and amazing thing about Petra, you say, well, how in the world out in the desert wilderness are all these people going to survive? I was reading a little bit of the archaeology on Petra, the ancient city. They had a water supply there in ancient days that could bring in 12 million gallons of fresh water a day. Now, if God can bring water out of a rock, He can bring water to a desolate desert city like Petra. And he's already got it accomplished. All he's got to do is turn the spigot back on, and those people will be taken care of. Now, this great battle that Daniel's describing here, all these nations coming together against the Jews and the Antichrist, is going to take place in Megiddo. Other places in the Bible, it's called the Valley of Jezreel. Megiddo means the plain of battles. One of the earliest recorded battles took place 1600 BC. Second Chronicles chapter 15 tells us about a battle that took place there when good King Josiah was wounded in a battle with Egypt. But God's going to gather all these nations together, those that hate the Jews, and I'm sure after a few years of this Antichrist ruling and reigning and exerting his will on them, they probably decided this is not as good a deal as we thought. But they're coming together here to destroy Jerusalem. Now, after Revelations, being we're into all this end time prophecy, I'm kind of wondering if we want to go to Zechariah. Turn over there just a second. Zechariah chapter 14. Let's see what he's got to say about all this. We'll look at verses 1 through 4. Behold, the day of the Lord cometh, and thy spoil shall be divided in the midst of these. For I will gather all nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city shall be taken, and the houses rifled, and the women ravished, and half of the city shall go forth into captivity, and the residue of the people shall not be cut off from the city. Then shall the Lord go forth and fight against those nations as when he fought in the day of battle. And his feet shall stand in that day upon the Mount of Olives, which is before Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives shall cleave in the midst thereof toward the east and toward the west, and there shall be a very great valley, and half of the mountain shall remove toward the north, and half of it toward the south. So he tells us how the Battle of Armageddon is going to turn out. All he has to do is tell me the Lord's going to come and take up the battle, and that's all I need to know about how this is going to end. And Jesus is going to come, and this be the end of all this fighting, be the end of a lot of things on that day. The end of that battle, the end of human government, the end of the Antichrist, and the beginning of a 1,000-year reign of the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. Now let's move into chapter 12. We'll get started. I don't think we'll get done with it today, but oh no, we're already getting close to quitting time. Chapter 12 and verse 1. And at that time shall Michael stand up, the great prince, which standeth for the children of thy people. And there shall be a time of trouble, such as never was since there was a nation, even to that same time. And at that time thy people shall be delivered, every one that shall be found written in the book. So Daniel says at that time, he's not talking about anyone just an exact date and time, but the general era of the time of tribulation and through all of that. And he says, Michael shall stand. Now, throughout the Bible, Michael has always been associated with a spiritual battle or spiritual warfare. And Daniel tells us here that God has given him, I'm going to guess from the very beginning of time, God's giving him a specific job, amongst other things, whatever he was doing, but he was to stand watch over the people of Israel. And he was their protector. Now, we talked some, I don't remember if last week or week before, about how God had heaven, the ranks and orders of the angels established, and compared it in a lot of ways in the way the military is established. There's a chain of command and a pecking order, whatever you want to call it. And I believe Michael is more powerful, have a higher rank than Satan was. That's why he's always, when these other angels get tied up with demons and fighting over Moses' body, and we've seen the prince of Persia, a demonic force, tie an angel up, bringing the message to Daniel. Michael shows up. Jude calls him an archangel. Probably, I'm going to guess 99% of people who call themselves Christians today will tell you Satan is an archangel. And that would be wrong. Satan was a cherub. And we know that those were close to the throne of God. But I believe Michael outranks him. He probably has more power and stronger than Satan. But anyway, Daniel's foretelling here of what the Bible has referred to as Jacob's trouble, and it being worse, just like Jesus said, worse than it's ever been since the very beginning of time, even all the way to the end. And like I said, if we want to look in Revelation before we get there about the trumpets and the seals and the bowls and the succession of God pouring out his wrath upon this sin-cursed world, it doesn't take much reading to figure out, I'm glad I'm not going to be here. But the Jewish people, stop and think about their history. Whether it was the Egyptians or the Assyrians or the Babylonians or the Romans or the Nazis, they've been under fire since the very beginning of time. But all of that, you could put all of those captivities and put all of that together, and it's not going to compare to the persecution that they're going to face and come under when the Antichrist turns his wrath upon them. But Daniel gives a ray of hope here. This thing's only going to go as far as, and it's only going to last as long as God's purpose is being accomplished. And there's a promise here of deliverance. We go back to this as we study the Bible a lot because it's important. God promised Abraham that he would make an everlasting covenant with him, that you will be my people and I will be your God, and God will never walk away from that promise. And here's Daniel, in all the midst of this trouble and tribulation and everything that's going on, this ray of hope comes out as he talks about deliverance. That deliverance is not for everybody. He makes that known here. It's only for those whose names are recorded in the book. Now, what possible book could he be talking about here? Even in the Old Testament here, Daniel's being told about the Lamb's Book of Life. Well, let's look in verse 2, and that probably is going to be as far as we get to go this morning. And many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. Looking through the whole of the Bible, I think I'm seeing 3 resurrections. One at the rapture, one at the end of the tribulation, and one at the end of the millennial reign of Christ, would be at the great white throne judgment. And maybe a fourth if we talk about when Jesus was resurrected. Remember, there was, from the power of his resurrection, there was a certain number of those around him who came back to life as well. Second Thessalonians, Apostle Paul describes the rapture. Turn over, I believe it's Revelation chapter 20 and verse 4. Yeah. And I saw thrones, and they sat upon them, and judgment was given unto them. And I saw the souls of them that were beheaded for the witness of Jesus and for the word of God, and which had not worshipped the beast, neither his image, neither had received his mark upon their forehead or in their hands, and they lived and reigned with Christ 1,000 years. We talked before about tribulation saints, and this here is telling us that, a lot of people think during that time that there's not going to be any saved, and the Bible's telling us different. They're going to be saved in a different way than we are. And it's going to be tough, because I'm guessing once you refuse that mark, you're probably immediately going to be martyred. I mean, whether it's the first 3.5 years or the last 3.5 years, if you refuse to bow down, worship the image of the beast, you're not going to be here for much longer. And then we know at the great white throne judgment, those dead have to come back to be judged. Of course, that one is one that's too late. There's no hope for those that are part of that resurrection and judgment. Let's take a minute. We got just a few minutes left here. There's a lot of confusion amongst Christian folks out there today regarding Sheol and Hades and hell and the lake of fire. Sheol, Hades, hell, as I understand it, those are all different names for the same place. In the Old Testament, when people died, their souls went to Sheol. Now, there was a great dividing, a great gulf fixed in that, a veil, whatever you want to call it. Those who died living a righteous life were regarded as God as righteous people, went to what was called Abraham's bosom. Those who weren't went to a place of torment. And some of the parables Jesus told, apparently they could see back and forth, talk back and forth, but there was a great gulf fixed and they could not pass one to the other. Now, when Jesus died and resurrected, the Bible said he led the captives away. The righteous he took from Sheol, their souls, to heaven with him, but the unrighteous stayed in a place of torment. And they will stay there until the great white throne judgment. It's a little different for us today. If believers in Jesus Christ, the minute we die, the Bible tells us we're in heaven. While our bodies are still here, we're waiting on that resurrection. When that rapture happens, the dead in Christ, all those Old Testament saints whose souls are in heaven, all that bodily resurrection is going to take place. The dead will rise first. Those that remain will be caught up together with them to meet him in the air. And so that leaves Abraham's bosom, the grave, all the saints, empty. Well, as people die, tribulation saints, I believe, just like us, their soul goes immediately to heaven, but that bodily resurrection will take place at Jesus' second coming. For those folks in Hades or hell, whatever we want to call it, they will stay there in torment. And this modern notion that's overtaken the Christian church just infuriates me that, well, it may be in torment for a little while, but eventually God's going to annihilate the soul and you'll just be nothing. So no more torment, no more pain, no more. That's not what the Bible describes. If you died without Jesus Christ, you're going to stay in that place of torment until that great white throne judgment takes place. And the only thing you've got to look forward to there is going from the place of torment to the lake of fire. And that's forever. I mean, forever means, I don't know how they redefine the modern day that, well, that's just for a little while and then it's all annihilated. I don't know where that comes from. Because ever since I've been a little kid, forever meant forever. And ever and ever and ever. So this is the ray of hope that they're giving Daniel, that in the end, there's going to be judgment. Some are going to rise to an everlasting paradise. Some are going to rise to everlasting shame and contempt. Well, thanks for being here this morning. We will, I think, finish chapter 12 next week.